with me. Wonderful ethnological discovery. Egyptian temples and ceremonies in Arizona. Remnants of a prehistoric race. The New York World of Sunday has a five-column letter from a correspondent at Santa Fe, which, if only half be true, it will set all the ethnological societies and literary bodies throughout Christendom agog with wonder and speculation. The letter purports to describe the adventures and discoveries of a certain plunky miner from the Rocky Mountains, known as Mountain Jim, who, in company with a man named Tim Jennings, started from Denver last September in search of a mining country which would yield better fortune than that to which they had been accustomed. Pushing forward day after day, meeting with constant disappointments in their hopes of finding paying lodes, they at last found that they had gotten beyond the Colorado and Utah boundaries and had entered upon a country which wore so foreboding an aspect that even their Indian guides refused to accompany them further. It appears, however, that although the country furnished neither grass nor water nor living thing, save insects and reptiles, the devil-may-care spirit which frontier experience is apt to provoke still drove them forward. They had both sworn to go on until they found something, and on they went, alone, stumbling forward into a vast arid waste in which they wandered for several days. They had at last found themselves imprisoned in a desert, more malignant still. Excuse me. The upshot of it was that their mules died of starvation, and the agony of thirst drove poor Jennings mad, and that in an insane parasium he fell over a precipice and was dashed to pieces. After enduring incalculable horrors, Mountain Jim, now utterly alone and stumbling on like a man in a dream, suddenly perceived a vast black gulf that seemed to open down into the core of the earth, and while yet he stood transfixed by terror, the pulverized soil of the arid mesa sank under his feet, and he slid down 2,000 feet into a valley in the midst of the desert, 40 or 50 miles in width, enclosed in an unscalable and unbroken vertical rim. The valley was the scene of his remarkable discoveries. Omitting his description of its beauty and verdure and heads of cattle, I apologize, you can see it gets a little hard to read. We come to the point at which the real ethnological interest begins. He found that the valley abounded at intervals with massive workmanship of human hands, invariably of stone couches, stone statues, stone tanks for holding water, and huge stone roofs supported by great pillars of stone. 2 stone causeways were also lined with a succession of stone houses, extending as far as the eye could reach, none of which had any windows, while all had the expanded wings of a bird rudely chiseled over the doorway. No human being had as yet been seen by our traveler, but while engaged in the outer examination of one of these houses, a startling cry broke out. Excuse me. The cry was instantly responded to from both sides. Simultaneously, every doorway was animated with darting forms. In less than a minute, says Harvey, both ridges were thick as anthills with people. I had hardly knew what to make of the matter at first. I lifted my hat and kept on the road. The farther I went, the more fuss they made. They were the most extraordinary people. The men were half naked. The women wore brilliant blue and red tunics, hung over one shoulder and buttoned under the left arm and reaching down to their knees. The children hadn't a rag. Still, they didn't look like Indians or savages. Their complexion was a cross between Indian and mulatto. The women are wonderfully well formed and good looking. A great commotion ensued, but no attempts at violence, and presently, by signs, our traveler began to parley with them, the result of it all being that he walked ahead of them, followed by a number of guards, and by the whole populace for a distance of several miles. When the party halted at a massive gate, which opened and let the hunter and his escort into a vast courtyard 1/2 mile square, surrounded by a stone wall. In the center of the court stood an edifice which excited his utmost amazement, and which his description would indicate was strongly, if not exactly, Egyptian in character. We quote, "The enormous masses of stone of which it was composed, and the majestic appearance of its construction, were such as I, whom had been a sailor and visited many American and English and Italian seaports, had not previously beheld. The front was adorned with a cornice and a frieze, covered with figures and hieroglyphics. A portico formed a 10 or 12 columns in 3 rows stood out from the front. The wings of the temple extended on each side. The shafts of the columns were covered by figures and hieroglyphics, raised in bas relief. Prominent among these figures was one, oft repeated, of the head of a female with cow's ears, an unmistakable resemblance to the Egyptian sculptures of the goddess Isis. The front of the doorway leading into the interior and the walls architraves of the interior were excessively embellished with figures, emblems, and hieroglyphics, some of them of such a nature that they materially assisted him in his subsequent conclusion as to the history of the people. His description of a circular tracery upon the ceiling, though not minute and exact enough to satisfy, would answer for a general description of the drawing of the zodiac. He was subsequently confined in a room as a prisoner, and thus confined for 2 weeks. His captors had, however, left untouched his revolver, which oversight was the probable means of his escape. One afternoon, to use his own language, he concluded, to shoot off his pistol and see if he couldn't wake them up. He fired twice in succession, aiming at the ugliest priest on the wall. The effect was immediate and gratifying. The ponderous stone door, swinging wide, revealed a cluster of dismayed guards. Discharging the revolver again towards the ceiling, he seized the occasion to stride boldly forth with an air and look intended to convince his persecutors that he was no longer to be trifled with. Pushing on through a long hall door, which the guards fled in terror, he passed into a vast apartment, used as a sanctuary. There, the alarm given by the guards aroused a multitude of people prostrate on the floor. Here, the spirit of deviltry induced him to fire his weapon again. The report produced fearful consternation. The crowd The crowd, evidently looking upon him as a supernatural being, parted right and left before him. Everybody did him reverence. Presently, a young girl, whom he supposed to be the princess, accosted him in alarm, an eloquent pantomime, entreating him to go away. With the assistance of a pencil and a thick stone slate, she explained that it was impossible to scale the barrier which surrounded the valley, but there was an uncertain river outlet to which he would be conveyed, and a barge provided to enable him to make the attempt. Arriving after 2 days' journey at the point selected and embarking in the boat furnished him, the gliding current before in a narrow and gigantic alley between the walls of naked rock which gradually enclosed him in impenetrable darkness, he felt that he was passing through a subterranean canyon. After several hours of intense suspense, during which the current changed to a rapid, and the rapid to a torrent, he reached the open light, and the close of the next day, the inhabitants of the Yampas Indians at the head of the big canyon of the Colorado, from which place he found his way to Santa Fe. His theory, based partly on his own observation and partly on the little communication he had with the persons while in prison, is, the world says, to the effect that centuries ago, antedating back farther than the discovery of this continent by Columbus by many centuries, a big encampment of migrating and highly civilized race was nearly destroyed by the convulsion of an earthquake, from the worst effects of which this now charming valley, together with a favored few of the people encamped therein, were exempt. The tumult and destruction of the event lifted the world around them in cyclopean ruins, and left them isolated forever between enormous barriers of rock, surmounted by an inaccessible embankment, in the flimsy soil of which no foothold could obtain. Saved thus by a miracle, retaining the religion and numerous enough to represent the arts of their race, shut out from all intercourse with the rest of the planet, and impressed by the conviction that since no human form has ever seen, no human cry was ever heard upon the verge above them, all humanity except themselves had perished. They had their descendants became possessed of an unchangeable fanaticism, which, while forbidding progress, prevented retrogression by continually impelling them to hold fast to the customs which the God had sanctioned by the great traditional event. Thank you for sticking with me during that long article. What do you guys think? Uh, Ancient Egyptian city found buried 2,000 feet in a canyon. Love this article. You spend enough time talking about Arizona, and there's some great books out there. Arizona being Egypt, and um, some of the kind of esoteric stories about dams and the damming downrange and what kind of things were buried. Especially the Hoover Dam being one of them. And America's covered in an incredible amount of dams, and the amount of lake that's been created by these dams as often as covered cities, ancient cities all over America. The small town my family's from in Georgia, um, they have a lake house, and the lake is a monster, and it was made by damming three of the large rivers in the area. And in the 80s, they found an ancient, they called it an Indian city, but it was all made of stone, very, very old. And I hypothesize that this is what's happened here, and especially all over. California is one of the most damned states in America, and Arizona has thousands and thousands. At these arid climates, that's how they get away with destroying a lot of land for the sake of um, not only hydroelectric power but also for irrigation purposes. But yeah, so that was a long read. Thanks for sticking with me.